Hello, I am FreeAZ, and this video is part of a series of videos I'm using to flesh out another One Piece theory, so you may want to watch that video first. Link in the description. I will do my best to make it so these videos can be watched on their own, but if you want the full context, you should watch the other video first. The basics are, I believe that Luffy's line in Chapter 1 about gathering 10 crewmates was meant to foreshadow Luffy meeting 10 crewmates in each sea he visited, for a total of 30 at the end of the series. I have found multiple patterns that not only share a rule, but work into another pattern I have found in how these characters were introduced, making me much less likely to believe these patterns are coincidence. Using these patterns, I was able to include every island we know Luffy will visit, or is very likely to visit, giving us a roadmap to the end of the series. The first video explains the patterns I have found, and gives a rough outline of how we are going to go from 9 crewmates to 30. These supplementary videos will flesh out anything else I think will happen in these individual arcs, though having the context of the first video will help. This video will contain spoilers for up to chapter 1083, so if you're not caught up, you've been warned. This video is going to be separated into 3 parts. First and second, I'll be going over a crewmate and an arc I believe I missed in my initial predictions, Helmeppo and New Marineford. Third, I'll be going over a pattern I believe I have found in the deaths in One Piece, and how it relates to the pattern of crewmates that Luffy met throughout his journey. We'll start with Helmeppo and how he fits into the patterns of the final crew. I originally did have Helmeppo on the list of 30 crewmates, but took him off in favor of Buggy by the end for multiple reasons. Mainly the conflict between him and Zoro meeting Luffy on the same island, and the realization of Buggy as the wild card. I now believe that because Buggy is the wild card, he is removed from the 10 crewmates that Luffy met in the East Blue. Before, Buggy disrupted some of the 8-2 rules, but I figured he could break the rules because he was the wild card. Helmeppo being added as another East Blue crewmate follows the 8-2 rules perfectly and fixes some of the trios I talked about in my first video. I now realize that those trios are actually quartets, just like the monster trio recently expanded to include Jinbei, whose bounty is higher than Sanji's right now. I previously had discounted Luffy and Buggy from these trios where necessary as the captain and wildcard, but with the 2 of them and Helmeppo added to these trios, we see that they all fit much better as quartets. The addition of Helmeppo also adds new context to the line from the first chapter about Luffy wanting about 10 crewmates. The reason for the about 10 in that line is because Oda wanted to hint at Luffy gaining 10 crewmates per sea throughout the series, but Buggy made it so that Luffy actually met 11 crewmates in the East Blue. We know through Oda that Luffy meant he wanted about 10 crewmates before the Grand Line. So the way we are supposed to interpret this line at the end of the series is that Luffy met about 10 crewmates in the East Blue, and exactly 10 in Paradise and the New World. This also makes it so that we as the readers meet 10 crewmates during the prologue, before the introduction of Sabo as the first crewmate Luffy met in the East Blue. Now on to Helmeppo and Zoro's placement on this chart of Luffy's journey. When a crewmate leaves the crew or rejects Luffy's invitation, their new island in the pattern becomes where they rejoin the crew. Zoro has threatened to leave the crew in the past, and I said in my Lodestar video that Zoro and Luffy will fight again at Lodestar, the last island in the Grand Line, just like they did at Whiskey Peak, the first island. It will be Luffy's first crewmate leaving him and rejoining the island before Luffy reaches Laugh Tale and finds the One Piece. It obviously wouldn't be permanent. It will likely just be Zoro testing Luffy's resolve or Zoro having a crisis of confidence after losing to Mihawk. But Zoro leaving the crew and rejoining here would move his island up to Lodestar, leaving room for Helmeppo at Shellstown. I also said that Luffy will have 29 crewmates with him at Laugh Tale, Oda's Goro Owase number for Nika, and then afterwards we'll save Vivi to make 30. However, with Helmeppo added, we have 30 at Laugh Tale and 31 with Vivi. There will be one other crewmate missing at Laugh Tale that Luffy will have to save before Vivi. Which brings me to the arc I believe I missed in my predictions. Luffy is going to save Sabo from being executed at New Marineford. This arc will happen right after Laugh Tale, and will directly lead into the Straw Hats storming Mary Joie, as New Marineford is located directly next to it. The great incident of historic proportions that the Grand Fleet gets called in for is the overthrowing of the Marines and the world government, and I believe this incident will take place over one day. In the morning, the Straw Hats, the Grand Fleet, and the Revolutionaries will attack New Marineford, taking down the Marines and saving Sabo. During the day, the Straw Hats will storm Mary Joie with the Grand Fleet, Revolutionaries, and the Blackbeard Pirates, taking down the world government and saving Vivi. And finally at night, the main Straw Hat crew and the Blackbeard Pirates will head above Mary Joie to God Valley to fight for their versions of the Will of D, with Luffy defeating Blackbeard as the dawn comes over the horizon and Luffy brings the dawn of the world. While Luffy and the crew are above on God Valley fighting Blackbeard's crew, the Grand Fleet and the Revolutionaries will be evacuating Mary Joie, as it is about to be completely destroyed. Now for the actual New Marineford arc itself, it will be focused on Dragon's story, the Revolutionaries, and the Marines. We now know that Dragon was formerly a Marine. It will be a former Marine turned revolutionary attacking the seat of the Marines to help his biological son save his foster son. I think this is where we will get Dragon's flashback, and it will likely focus on his time as a Marine and how he became disillusioned with the world government. At some point during this arc, Luffy and the Grand Fleet will show up for Sabo like Whitebeard and his fleet showed up for Ace. However, the true role of Whitebeard will be played by Dragon, who has a similar relationship to Sabo as Whitebeard and Ace, a foster father. In Marineford, Ace was questioned about his heritage as Roger's son under the threat of execution, but rejected it and declared Whitebeard was his father. In Wano Act 3, Momo was put into a similar situation. Kaido said he would spare Momo if he rejected his heritage, to which he proudly declared he was a Kozuki. New Marineford is going to have another version of this, with Sabo potentially being offered mercy if he declares his biological heritage as a noble, but he will reject it and claim that Dragon is his father. We know that Dragon considers his children his greatest weakness, and Sabo is in a lot of ways more Dragon's son than even Luffy is. Dragon will definitely come to save him. This is the arc where the Straw Hats and their forces will take down the Admirals and the Marines as a whole. A few of the Marines will likely turn up again at Mary Joie, but this is the arc where they will be the main enemy, while Mary Joie will be focused on the world government as a whole and the Celestial Dragons. I personally think that Luffy will fight Akainu while Sabo is captured. However, Sabo and his awakened blue flames will end up defeating or killing Akainu by the end, the inverse of Akainu's confrontation with Ace. By the end of this arc, the Marines as a whole will be dissolved, with many of them likely turning against the world government and fighting with the Straw Hats at the insistence of Kobe, similar to his outburst during the first Marineford. Sabo would obviously not die like Ace did. Luffy will save his brother this time, but I do believe that this is a likely spot for Dragon's death, him dying to protect his sons like Whitebeard did. I previously said that Dragon would die at Lodestar. However, I now believe Rayleigh is more likely to die there, as he is another one of Luffy's mentor figures, and it would also be an ex-Roger pirate sacrificing himself to make sure Luffy reaches Laugh Tale. Which leads me to the final part of this video, where I will go over a pattern I believe I have found within the deaths of One Piece. Back in my 10 Crewmates Per Sea video, I went over a pattern I believe Oda made while introducing the full Straw Hat crew. For each island Luffy visited, he either gained or lost an ally, and when Luffy leaves a location and revisits it, it counts as another slot that needs to be filled. This list was previously incomplete, as I realized that there are certain arcs, like Whole Cake Island, where Luffy visits multiple islands throughout the arc, and these account for the allies and deaths I previously did not include, like Zeus and the death of Pedro. On top of that, I believe Oda is making an allusion to the Rule of 3 myth in real life, where it is said that celebrities die in groups of 3. When it comes to the people Luffy has met, they seem to also die in groups of 3. Now I'm going to go over all of the deaths in the series so far, though keep in mind that this pattern only applies to the deaths in the present-day story. Deaths that occur in flashbacks, including Chapter 1, do not follow this pattern of 3. This pattern starts once Luffy sets out on his journey. Now, the first deaths we have in this series are Commodore Pudding Pudding in the Arlong Park arc, and 4 Alabastan Royal Guards in the Alabasta arc, and they bring up another important rule to this pattern. These characters, quite literally, were made to die. They had no overall importance to the story, and more importantly, they never met Luffy. This chart is about the allies Luffy gained and lost on his journey. If Luffy never met a character, Luffy does not have to visit an island to represent them, and they do not have to die in threes. There are other moments that this happens in the series. For example, Jigra, the underworld organ trader that Katakuri killed. He was literally introduced to die and never met Luffy. However, from now on, I will not be mentioning most deaths that do not fit this pattern. Now, the first island that actually fits into this pattern is Sabaody. However, I will be going over Sabaody near the end because Oda did something special here. The first deaths after that are Ace, Whitebeard, and Oars Jr. at Marineford. Luffy did meet Oars Jr., as Oda specifically included a panel of Oars noticing Luffy as he tried to save Ace, and I highly doubt Luffy failed to notice the 60-meter tall giant. The 3 visits that account for these deaths are Luffy's initial visit to Marineford, Luffy returning to Marineford to ring the bell at the end of Part 1, and the final visit will be Luffy visiting Ace and Whitebeard's graves at the end of the series. After that, we have 3 deaths at Punk Hazard, with the deaths of Virgo, Monet, and Smiley, and this will explain a few more of the rules in this pattern. Once again, this list is about the allies Luffy met on his journey. When it comes to his enemies, Luffy does not have to visit an island to represent their deaths. However, they still die in groups of 3. I'd also like to talk about Smiley, as he is the first instance of a very important rule going forward, and that is the importance of whether something does or does not have a will. Smiley is an inanimate object brought to life by a devil fruit, and according to the Gorosei, Zoan devil fruits have wills of their own. This is a very important factor in determining whether or not something counts towards this pattern. For example, later on in the Egghead portion of this video, I count the Iron Giant as an ally Luffy met on Egghead Island. I initially was hesitant to put what is essentially a robot on this list. However, him saying, "I'm sorry, Joy Boy," indicates to me that it has regrets and emotions of its own, and therefore its own will. Another reason the point of wills is important is because I believe that homies do count as entities with a will, while Kanjuro's drawings do not. Homies quite literally have a soul, and while they are subservient to Big Mom, we have seen that when a Vivre card of their Devil Fruit user is in play, they have the ability to choose who to follow, and therefore a will. Moving on to Kanjuro's drawings, I'd like to talk about Zoe, and the 3 drawings that Kanjuro drew to get everyone up the elephant. Despite Oda making a big deal out of Ryanosuke's death, I don't think that Kanjuro's drawings count as having wills of their own. Kanjuro's drawings are created, do whatever task they are assigned, and then dissipate. They have shown no capacity for free will, and the closest thing that we have seen to free will actually helps prove my point. In Wano, smoldering remains of Kazunbo, the fire giant Kanjuro made to destroy Onigashima, appeared to Orochi near the end. And based on Kazunbo's voice, who shares the same voice actor as Kanjuro, Orochi identified Kazunbo as being Kanjuro himself. Kanjuro projected his will onto his creation as he was dying, and controlled it directly. However, this is Kanjuro's will, not the will of the drawing itself. On top of that, there are some inconsistencies with the 3 drawings that helped the Straw Hats climb Zoe. Oda made it so that there were 3 drawings that died, as an allusion to the rule of 3s. However, Luffy only met Ryanosuke. He did not meet the other 2 drawings that pulled Kinemon and Kanjuro up. It is also hard to discern whether they would count as Luffy's allies or enemies anyway, as they did truly help the Straw Hats with their task, but their master was Kanjuro, who we know was the Straw Hats' enemy. I think Oda used the drawings on Zou to throw a bit of a curveball, and I will go over more about Kazunbo's death during the Wano portion, but the main point is, the drawings do not have a will of their own, so they do not count as allies or enemies that Luffy met. Moving on to Whole Cake, Luffy visited 8 locations, which I will put up on screen now. First, the crewmate that Luffy met was Pudding. Second, we have a group of 3 homies Luffy met. Zeus, who is obviously already part of the crew, and when Pudding joins the crew, she has 2 personal homies that Big Mom gave her, so they count as the other 2 allies. As for the deaths, the obvious one is Pedro, then Peckham's, whose fate is still technically unknown. As for King Bomb, the tree homie who ferried around the Straw Hats, Oda did play around with his true loyalty a bit, with him insisting he only followed Nami because of the V-Ray card. However, the presence of Big Mom is supposed to overwrite the V-Ray card holder's orders. Yet King Bomb continued to follow Nami's orders after she gave him some motivation, like Zeus did later. Just like Zeus, King Bomb consciously chose to help the Straw Hats in the end, and as Big Mom killed him, she emphasized his betrayal. King Bomb counts as Luffy's ally. Finally, we have a special exception on this list, Katakuri and the Mirror World. Luffy technically visited the Mirror World multiple times. However, the Mirror World is a strange place compared to the other entries on this list. It is not so much a location on a map, but rather a world created from a devil fruit. I honestly do not think it counts as a location Luffy visited. However, I believe this location still has a representative, Katakuri, the Mirror of Luffy. I don't believe Katakuri will join the crew or anything like that, though I do think it is likely Katakuri will help Luffy in some capacity by the end of the series. I don't think I have to explain too much why the Mirror World represents Katakuri, as him being Luffy's mirror is obvious. However, I do have to mention that as the Mirror of Luffy, he murdered 3 of his underlings, the 3 chefs who saw his face, which leaves us with 3 enemies Luffy met that died during Whole Cake. Now on to Wano, and this one is a bit complicated. I'm going to have to first explain why each of the regions of Wano count as their own island, and to do that, I'm going to explain what Onigashima truly is. This is the flag of Little Oars Jr., and the important thing to note is the Roman numeral 3. Oars Jr. is actually Oars III, while the Oars from Thriller Bark is actually Oars Jr. Onigashima is the skull of the original Oars, and the reason he was called the Continent Puller is because all of the regions of Wano were once separate islands, but Oars pulled them together to create Wano. We know from Odin's father that there was a major geographical change in Wano during the Void Century, and this major geographical change was Oars pushing these islands together over ancient Wano below, and then creating the borders of Wano to protect it from the world government. The reason I'm explaining this is because Luffy visiting each region of Wano counts as a separate island. Wano is also tricky because I believe we are going to return to Wano later, so I have to do some guesswork. Currently, Luffy has visited 6 islands in Wano, which are now on screen, and I believe the return to Wano will be relatively short, so I think Luffy will only end up visiting 2 islands to match the amount of locations Luffy visited in Tado Land. First, we have 2 crewmates, Tama and Yamato, and when Tama joins, her 2 animal companions will also join. I do believe that there will also be a 3rd animal companion here to match the 3 homies from Whole Cake, but I put Onimaru here as a placeholder because I think that would be a cool option, but it is also just as likely that Tama will just find another animal that we haven't met yet. Now on to the deaths. This is also a complicated matter that may take some explaining, especially because we haven't had enough time since the end of Wano for Oda to reveal which deaths were fake-outs. First, the ally deaths. We have confirmation that Ashura Doji and Izo are dead, so that counts for 2 of them. Many people may think that Yasui was the 3rd death of Wano. However, Yasui's introduction and death both occurred during Wano Act 2, when Luffy was in Udon prison. Luffy never met Yasue, so he does not count towards this pattern. I think Oda's intention with Yasue's death was to have a placeholder third death in Wano that doesn't actually count, while the real third death will be Kinemon when we return to Wano. This is the reason Oda gave him a fake-out death in Wano, to foreshadow his actual death later. Now, the enemy deaths are where I believe most of the fake-out deaths are. I've said many times why I don't believe Kaido and Big Mom are dead yet, so I'll skip over those ones. Oda also left the fates of Hawkins and Drake up in the air. However, I don't think Oda is going to kill off any of the supernovas just yet. And in One Piece, a character having an only 1% chance of surviving means that they probably did survive. We also have two potentially dead CP0 agents, Guernica, who supposedly died to Kaido. However, we already have some evidence he survived. It has been revealed that the picture of Gear 5th on Luffy's wanted poster was taken by Guernica, and Luffy did not transform into Gear 5th until after Kaido supposedly killed Guernica. There's also a good chance that his partner Maha also survived. Oda made it look like Izo and Maha killed each other, but we have only gotten confirmation of Izo's death so far. I think it is highly likely both CP0 agents survived. I think the true enemy deaths in Wano are Orochi, Kanjuro, and Fukurokuju. I believe that one of these three deaths is likely to be a fake out, but they will die when we return to Wano like Kinemon. Part of the reason I believe one of them survived is because of Kazunbo and Yasue. I've already explained why I don't believe Kazunbo has its own will. It's just Kanjuro's will. However, I think Oda did the same thing for Kazunbo as he did for Yasue. Kazunbo was a placeholder third death that did not actually fit the pattern, and we will get the true third enemy death when we return to Wano. I think the most likely option is that Fukurokuju survived, and that he currently possesses Orochi's devil fruit, though it could also be Kanjuro or Orochi himself. I believe that Blackbeard's third devil fruit is going to end up being Orochi's, and Blackbeard has killed to get both of his current devil fruits. I think he will either kill Fukurokuju or Kanjuro for safeguarding Orochi's fruit. Now I'd like to talk about some other deaths we supposedly got between the Reverie and Egghead. The deaths of Cobra, Don Quixote Miosguard, and Absalom. I believe all of these deaths are going to end up being fake-outs, and I'll start by explaining the most important one, Cobra. Cobra is a big one, as Oda heavily implied his death and even named the chapter The Death of Cobra. However, I am positive at this point that this is a fake-out. In the same chapter Cobra died, he revealed that not only Vivi, but that he is also a D-Clan member. Every single D-Clan member we have seen die, or sometimes even just in the face of death, has died with a smile on their face. Cobra did not, and I highly doubt Oda would forget that detail in the same chapter he revealed Cobra as a D. On top of that, we know that Imu wants Vivi. We never saw the killing blow against Cobra. I think it is highly likely Imu kept Cobra alive as a bargaining chip to lure Vivi in. As for Absalom, Katarina Devon mentions that his body is intact, and knowing Moria, he's going to put a shadow in him. I don't think we've seen the last of Absalom, sadly. It also may be important to note that Dr. Hogback modified Absalom's body. There's a decent chance that Hogback's modifications let Absalom survive whatever it is Blackbeard does to steal Devil Fruit powers, and that he was just playing possum. As for Miosguard, I personally don't think this is the end for him, mainly because I think this is a weird point for his story to end. I think he's going to end up helping Luffy take down the Celestial Dragons. He very well could be dead though, and it wouldn't even matter. Luffy never met Miosguard, so he doesn't have to die in a pattern of 3. I just think Oda has more he wants to do with him, and people have survived much worse in One Piece. Now on to the current arc, Egghead. Luffy has so far visited 5 locations, and I think it's going to end that way as well. First, Luffy met one crewmate, Bonnie. However, I believe she will end up leaving the crew at some point, and her island will count as the location she rejoins. Her slot will be filled with what I believe will end up being the Straw Hat's 3rd ship, Punk Records, as an add-on to the Sunny. As I was editing this video, this panel of Punk Records getting cut in half just came out, so I felt I should address it. Oda has built up Punk Records as being One Piece's version of the internet. and has already alluded to Vegapunk living on through his brain. It's going to be an important part of the story in the future. The majority of Punk records is still intact, and you can see after the cut that most of it is still floating. This isn't the end for Punk records. Second, we have an ally in the Iron Giant, who will likely end up helping the Straw Hats escape Egghead. Finally, we have 3 ally deaths in Shaka, Pythagoras, and the Stella. Oda is currently putting some death flags on Edison as well, so I feel the need to mention it. If Edison does end up dying, there's a decent chance one of these deaths is going to end up being a fake out. I don't think there will be any enemy deaths in Egghead at this point, as there have been none so far, and if Oda was going to kill off 3 enemies, I feel like at least one of them would have died by now. However, Oda could kill off 3 together near the end, and Katarina Devon can now take the form of Saturn, so I think it is likely he will die at some point in the future so she can pose as him. Now from this point in the video going forward, I'm going to be using this pattern of 3 to try to predict some deaths I think are very likely in future arcs. Though Oda could make Luffy visit any number of islands in future arcs, so it's hard to tell how many slots are available for each arc until it happens. I feel very strongly that the deaths I predict going forward will happen, but I also think it is very likely that I am missing some deaths, especially the enemy deaths. The next deaths in the story I think will happen during the return to Wano. However, I already went over those, so I'm going to move on to Lodestar Island. I think that it is likely that Luffy will visit 4 islands here. First, I explained earlier that I believe Zoro will temporarily leave the crew and fight Luffy, so the first visit stands for Zoro rejoining the crew. Then I believe the 3 ally deaths will be Shanks, Garp, and Rayleigh, 3 of Luffy's mentors and 3 figures tied to Roger, dying right before Luffy reaches Laugh Tale. The 3 enemies I believe will be Kaido, who will be killed by Zoro, Big Mom, who will be killed by Sanji, and Kuzan, who I believe Blackbeard will kill himself for potentially being a member of SWORD. These deaths are important because with the deaths of Shanks, Kaido, and Big Mom, all 4 of the original Yonko will die just before Luffy finds the One Piece and ushers in a new era. I also believe Garp's death will be the moment Kobe truly inherits Garp's will, right before Kobe realizes at Laugh Tale that in order to truly protect the world, he needs to join Luffy and take down the world government. Now on to New Marineford. There are 3 central figures to the revolutionaries that stand above the rest: Dragon, Ivankov, and Kuma. And I think they are specifically grouped as 3 because they are going to give their lives to save Sabo. In a similar way to Kobe, this will also be the moment that Sabo truly inherits Dragon's will, just before he joins Luffy, and with the 3 figureheads of the revolutionaries gone, he will lead the revolutionary army to storm Mary Joie. There is also a good chance that there will be 3 enemy deaths here, namely Akainu. However, I do think there is a decent chance Akainu will be involved in trying to protect the world government during Mary Joie, and it is not as simple as Akainu and 2 admirals die. It is very likely that after New Marineford, Fujitora and probably Kizaru at this point will help Luffy take down the government. Now it could be that the 3 enemy deaths are Akainu, Ryokugyu, and Kong or something like that, but those are more guesses than anything, nothing I'm confident in. Now while I do believe that there will likely be deaths at Mary Joie and God Valley, I would like to first go all the way back to Sabaody. Each of the groves counts as a different location Luffy visited, and it is by far the arc where he visits the most locations, so Oda did something special here. Between Sabaody and Return to Sabaody, Luffy visited 18 locations, which I'll put on screen. For the most part, Oda makes it clear which groves Luffy does and doesn't go to. However, there are a few locations I'd like to bring up. First, Duval's Fortress. So this isn't a ship, and I figured if the Baratier counts as a location, so does this. After that, the grove with the bubble bike salesman is the only unnumbered grove Luffy visits. Finally, Oda doesn't make it completely clear which groves of Sabaody Park Luffy visits. However, Oda does make it clear that it is spread across 3 groves, and if we assume Luffy visited all 3, we get to 18. The first 2 slots are filled by the 2 crewmates Luffy met there, Kid and Law. The final 16 slots are actually 2 groups of 8. First the 8 fake-out deaths of Luffy's crewmates at the end of Sabaody. Luffy truly believed his crew died here, and broke down when he couldn't save them. To Luffy, this was the death of his crew, at least at the time. The other group of 8 is the fake Straw Hats at return to Sabaody. The fake Straw Hats did not realize Brook was on the crew, and only had 8 members. They obviously aren't allies in the traditional sense, but I think it's obvious what Oda was going for. They might also come back towards the end and help the Straw Hats out in some way, intentionally or not. Now, the reason I saved Sabaody for the end is not just because Oda tried something different for the island where Luffy visits the most locations, but because the 8 fake-out Straw Hat deaths actually fit into the pattern of 3 deaths. The Goro Owase number for Blackbeard's Darkness Fruit is 38. That's why his birthday is August 3rd, why he has 3 skulls with the 8-ended bone pattern, and why he will have at least 3 devil fruits by the end. The pattern of 3 and 8 works together because Oda is tying together death and darkness. Going back to Mary Joie and God Valley, I believe Oda is also going to work in 8 deaths in those arcs, as that will be the very end of the series. I don't know exactly who will die during these arcs, as there are a lot of variables, but I can give a rough idea. At Mary Joie, it will likely just be 8 members of the upper levels of the world government, likely Imu, the Gorosei, and some of the gods' knights or other celestial dragons. At God Valley, it will likely be 8 Blackbeard crewmates. And remember, the Rocks pirates were known for killing each other, and these are definitely the sort of characters that would kill each other without a second thought. I don't know exactly who it would be, maybe just the villains the fanbase seems to really find morally repugnant, like Caesar, who experimented on kids, or Rob Lucci for being the definition of a tool, but in reality it's whoever Oda wants to die. When it comes to Blackbeard himself, Luffy has never killed the main villain of an arc, so I don't believe Blackbeard will end up dying. However, those who have watched my One Piece video will know that I think Oda has a fate worse than death set up for Blackbeard. Both of these sets of 8 would mirror the 2 sets of 8 at Sabaody, and because they are Luffy's enemies, Luffy does not need to visit extra locations to represent them. Finally, I'd like to end the video talking about the Straw Hats. All of the Straw Hats will have to at least be alive during God Valley to fight Blackbeard's crew, and Luffy's crew will end up winning that fight, so I don't really think any of the Straw Hats will end up dying. Law and Usopp do have some death flags, so if any of them do die, I believe it will be them, but I'm still doubtful. Luffy, however, will definitely have a fake-out death at the end. Oda has continuously brought up that Luffy has been shortening his lifespan through some method or another, while also making it a parallel to Roger's disease. However, Chopper's dream is to create the Panacea, a medicine that can cure any illness. Oda is most likely going to make it look like Luffy is going to die after defeating Blackbeard, but Chopper will be the one to cure him. And with that, I've finally finished the original series of videos I started about a year ago. Sorry for the wait, everyone. Not only did it take quite a bit of time and work to figure everything out, but I wanted to see how the deaths in Egghead would play out, and we've had more chapter breaks this past year than I think we've ever had. I appreciate everyone being patient. The next video I release is going to be the remake of the original 10 Crewmates Per Sea video, and I'm planning for it to be something special. So until then, peace everybody.